Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back in Houston, as we pronounce it in New York City.
I never heard that in New York City. Is that?
Yeah, Houston Street.
I need to get out of Houston and find
I
out
guess
what they're saying about
Get
us.
around, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for that introduction, because your candor about your own experiences is, it's so important. This has been, mental health in general has been a closeted phenomenon for way too long, and people's experiences with psychedelics too has not been something people felt comfortable talking about, certainly publicly. So thanks for your courage in talking about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. We're all amongst friends here, right?
Yeah.
It's just been so interesting to follow your path. And tell me if I'm wrong, when you started writing about psychedelics, it looked to me like your curiosity was moved in a more personal way. What drew you into psychedelics?
Well, there's a backstory and a front story here. I'd had a long-standing interest in our relationship to plants. People who know my work know I wrote a couple books about plants, more or less. And in Botany of Desire, my third book, I had looked at the different uses to which we put plants. And some of them are kind of obvious and make a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view, such as food and beauty. But we also have used them always and everywhere, with one exception, to change consciousness. And that's always been an interesting and somewhat mysterious phenomenon to me. Like, why would it be adaptive for people to take plants that consume plants and fungi, mushrooms, that change their consciousness? Changing your consciousness is dangerous in the natural context. You're more vulnerable to predation, presumably. You're more likely to have accidents. You're basically giving up control over yourself and your capabilities. But it must offer us something, or the drug takers would have been edited out by natural selection, and they haven't been. Every culture on Earth, with one exception that we know of, has had some plant that they used to change consciousness. And it could be, in mild ways, the way caffeine changes our consciousness, or to relieve pain like opiates do, or for more profound experiences like psychedelics. The one exception are the Inuit, and the only reason is nothing good grows where they live. When they move to Canada or wherever, they tend to get with the program. So this is a deep human desire, and I've always been curious about it. And I wrote a chapter about cannabis in Botany of Desire. And so it was in the back of my mind as something that I was curious about. And then I started in the early 2010s, I started reading about these very weird sounding experiments going on at Johns Hopkins and NYU. And they were giving high dose of psilocybin, which is the chemical in magic mushrooms, in a synthetic form, to cancer patients to help them deal with what they called their existential distress, their anxiety and fear around either their impending death or around recurrence of cancer. And this struck me as a very peculiar idea. I just can't imagine receiving a terminal diagnosis and then wanting to have a big psychedelic trip. The loss of control and the unpredictability, it seemed to me might plunge you further into depression and anxiety. But I got an assignment to write about this for The New Yorker for a piece that came out in 2015 called The Trip Treatment. It's available online for free. And I started talking to these volunteers in this trial. And their stories were just fascinating, and that how a single experience with psilocybin had completely reset their attitude toward their death. They were very moving stories, and this was a very sympathetic patient population. I think it was kind of canny on the part of the researchers if you want to get people to take this seriously as a treatment. But I'll just give you an example of one woman I talked to give you a sense of what was happening. This was a woman who was a figure skating instructor who lived in Manhattan, and she was a kind of a slight woman who seemed sort of timid outwardly, and she had had ovarian cancer, and she had been treated successfully. That wasn't the case for all the volunteers. And she was doing very well, but she was paralyzed by the fear of recurrence, which is a common fear for people who've been treated with cancer. And it was just completely interfering with her life. And so she had this guided psilocybin trip. I should just very briefly tell you what the protocol is, because it's not like they just give you a magic mushroom and send you on your way. It's a very controlled situation. You're prepared, you're given like a 2 or 3 hour, actually in these trials even more, but several 2-hour sessions of preparation where the therapists get to know you and your anxieties and what your issues are, and they help you set an intention. You mentioned an intention earlier of what you're trying to accomplish. And then they sit with you for the duration of the trip, which can last like 6 hours. There are 2 people there with you, and they do very little. They, might offer a comforting hand, or help you get up to go to the bathroom, but they don't direct you in any way. They say very little. They might just ask you, how are you doing? In the preparation, they've told you what to do under certain circumstances. Like if you see something really frightening, they'll tell you, go toward it. Don't go away from it. Don't run from it. If you see a staircase, go up it. If you see a door, open it. In other words, surrender to what's happening. In and through is something they'll tell you. And this is important because I think if you fight to resist what's going on in your mind, that's when you have what we call a bad trip. You get very, very anxious because you can't control what's going on in your mind for a period of time. So in her trip, and this was common of a lot of the cancer patients, she went into her body and took a tour of her body. And while she was doing this, she saw this black mass under her rib cage. And she knew what it was. It wasn't her cancer, right? She had ovarian cancer, so it wasn't in the right place. But she knew it was her fear, this black mass of fear. And as soon as she saw it, she screamed out. She said, "Get the fuck out of my body." Imagine the therapists who don't know what's going on. And with that, it vanished, and her fear went away, and it never came back. And so this was, an astonishing change in her life that happened over the course of an afternoon. Afterwards, you have what's called an integration session where the therapist no doubt said, "What was going on when you said that?" And she told the story, and because the memory of these experiences is quite vivid. These are not like dreams at all. They stick with you for years and years and years. So my experience talking to those people, and then seeing the results of this trial, which were quite successful, about 2/3 of people got significant relief. I wrote this article, and about halfway through I realized there's a book here. I should really write a book about this. There was nothing out that wasn't written by, psychonauts, people who were just already obsessed with psychedelics. And if I was going to write a book about it, I had to have this experience myself. I had to understand how a single experience could have that kind of effect on you. So that was the backstory. That's how I came to do it. And I'm very fortunate in that I've had a wonderful book editor for my whole career, for I think 9 books now. And I had had a series of successful books about food and nutrition. And when I told her I want to write about psychedelics, she was like, "Go for it." So I'm very lucky. I mean, there's always a lot of pressure to kind of repeat what you've done successfully before, but she was open and happy to have me do something new. So I embarked.
Well, let me stay with death and dying for a moment. It was in the title of your book. In your New Yorker article, as I understand it, the piece that these patients were getting was not about connecting with the afterlife, which you think would be the most comforting. It was something else. What was going on? What was working for them?
Some of them. Some did have glimpses of what would happen to them after. somebody would describe seeing this one man I focused on who did die, saw this, what he called the great plane of consciousness, and he thought that's where he would go. And it looked like it was a comforting place to be. He was certainly not ready to go now, but he had had a glimpse, and it made him reconciled. In fact, he gave up his chemotherapy after that in favor of having a better quality of life for a shorter amount of time. And that's not an unusual outcome. And for people who work in oncology, you know how significant that is. But then others would have a highly naturalistic experience of the afterlife. This one woman I talked to went flying around the world and ended up going underground and hitting the wall of a crematorium and realizing that she would be dispersed and her molecules would be taken up by these plants. Now, that's not an unrealistic vision of the afterlife. But she found it, because of the psychedelics, incredibly comforting. Like, this is fine. I'm going to be dead, but I'm also going to go on in nature, as part of nature. And so it was a variety. The thing about psychedelics, it doesn't program a particular experience. It all has to do with, set and setting, as you mentioned. These are terms coined by Timothy Leary in the early 60s. And what he's getting at is the fact that the mindset you bring into it, as well as the physical setting or environment in which you have the experience, shapes it to an unusual degree. That there's something kind of unspecific about the drugs. Stan Grof, who was a psychiatrist who worked with psychedelics a lot in the 60s, a Czech who came to America, called them unspecific mental amplifiers. It's not a very felicitous phrase, but he's onto something. They don't necessarily take you here or there. It's really what your intention is and the setting is and what you're bringing to the experience. Whereas, everybody kind of knows what it feels like to ingest marijuana or have alcohol. But with psychedelics, it's highly variable.
People do come away with different interpretations of their trip. Some feel they connected with God, some with a transpersonal mind, others are more materialistic. How do you know what interpretation you can rely on?
Well, rely on, you mean the truth quotient of these interpretations. You can't. William James wrote about this in Varieties of Religious Experience, where he wrote a lot about the mystical experience, which is something that these researchers believe in. It's not the right word, but the mystical experience is something he defined that you see all through the history of religion, but people have them spontaneously. They're not necessarily religious, but it's an experience defined by a few characteristics: a transcendence of self, a sense of merging with something that you described in your introduction, merging with something larger than yourself, transcendence of space and time, a kind of euphoric feeling. It's a well-known phenomenon. It happens in meditation. It happens people who fast or do vision quests or isolate for a long period of time. It's something we're wired for. We don't know why. But psychedelics occasions those experiences fairly reliably. And James wrote about, well, how can you say what's true and what's not true? I mean, are these insights, especially these spiritual insights or divine encounters, are they true? And he basically said there's no way to know. We should judge them by their fruits. In other words, if the experience has a positive effect on one's life, that's good enough. He was a pragmatist. And I think that's a pretty healthy attitude. We're never going to be able to say whether it's true or not. There are psychological truths that come out of it that, with the help of a good therapist, and sometimes even without, people have profound insights into themselves or what they should be doing. People have creative insights too. There's a whole history of scientists having breakthroughs, imaginative breakthroughs on psychedelics, and there are a great many poets who have, and So, are those true or false? Well, if you have an image on how to build a PCR machine, which Kerry Mullis did on an acid trip, he was able to imagine the DNA molecule and how to multiply it, and invented PCR. I guess that was true. It worked.
Your book also includes the title, that is, Depression and Addiction. And your book also gets into difficult to treat conditions like PTSD and eating disorders. What should we understand about these healing breakthroughs from psychedelics?
So psilocybin and MDMA, which is the name for ecstasy, have been the ones that have gotten the most attention from researchers. They're not working with LSD strictly for pragmatic reasons. It carries a lot of baggage politically, but it also is such a long trip that you'd have to pay overtime to your therapists. It can go on for 12 hours, whereas psilocybin is only 6 hours or so. So it kind of fits into the therapeutic day a little better. But they will be doing work on those other psychedelics, and mescaline too, at some point. So they're being trialed for depression, both major depression and treatment-resistant depression. Obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a really interesting trial going on at Yale right now. Smoking addiction, alcohol addiction, cocaine addiction are all being trialed, and some of those are done and have been successful. And let's see what else. Eating disorders, I think, is underway or just got started at Johns Hopkins. And there's a couple others, about to happen. And, my first reaction when I heard that was, well, what is this, a panacea? I mean, you're trying out all these different things. Why would the same drug work on all those things? And I put this question to Tom Insel, who's a very prominent psychiatrist. He was head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And the first thing he said to me is, why are you so sure those are different things? They all may be symptoms of the same underlying mental disorder, which could be an excessively rigid brain, a mind that is stuck in loops of rumination. So we may discover at some point there is an underlying phenomenon that expresses itself, manifests in all these different ways, which I thought was a very interesting way to think about it. And in fact, there is a group at Mass General at Harvard that is directly studying rumination. What psychedelics appear to do is make it possible to break habits of thought, destructive habits of thought and behavior. Addiction is such a habit, obviously. And how this works, we're not really sure, but there is a kind of relearning, repatterning of the mind that can happen. And it was very striking in the case of the addicts that I interviewed. I interviewed several people in the smoking cessation and the cocaine trial. And in smoking, people would have these experiences, like this woman described to me. She'd smoked since she was 20 and she was in her 50s. And her trip took her all over the world, and she saw the Taj Mahal and the pyramids. It was like this, grand tour of everything, and it was thrilling. And she came out of it thinking, God, there's so much to do in life and so much to see, and isn't it stupid to smoke cigarettes and shorten your life? Now, this is not a profound insight, and she probably had that thought sober at various times. But there's something about the psychedelic experience that makes sort of semi-banal insights like that feel really earth-shaking and profound and sticky enough to actually act on them. And people make resolutions that actually hold. And she immediately lost her taste for cigarettes. It did feel stupid. It felt like something she didn't need to do. And this goes back to the mystical experience. There's one other characteristic of it that I didn't mention, which is what James called the noetic quality. The fact that the insights you have during a mystical experience have a status. They're more like revealed truth than an opinion or an insight. They just have this, etched on stone tablets quality. So that's part of it. Now, what's going on in the brain, there are two theories that I think are interesting, or three. I'll see if I can quickly outline them. The one I talk about in the book is the fact that they have found, taking fMRI images of people at the height of a psychedelic experience, and can you imagine being like rolled into one of those tubes while tripping? We owe these volunteers a large debt of gratitude for their courage. They have found that what's going on in their brain during this experience is that a particular brain network called the default mode network is deactivated. Now, what is the default mode network? It connects several different brain structures, and without going into their names, that seem to be involved in the generation of the sense of self. Time travel is here, your ability to imagine the future and remember the past, which is very important, obviously, to our identity. Without a sense of the past, you disappear as a person. It's also where theory of mind takes place, our ability to imagine the mind of another, and the narrative self, the way we kind of weave what happens in our lives into the story we tell of who we are. All this is happening in that network. To the extent that you can say the ego has an address in the brain, which is oversimplifying, it's the default mode network. And what was interesting is that when volunteers describe the experience of ego dissolution, there is this sense of complete depersonalization that happens on a high dose, not always, but very often on a high dose of psychedelics. Their default mode network went quiet, and they could correlate this pretty exact, the experience and what we were seeing. Curiously enough, really experienced meditators, when put in an fMRI, people with 10,000 hours or more, they too have a deactivation. The same network goes quiet. So it could be that this muffling or quieting or temporary relief from the voice of your ego, which traps us, of course, in all these loops of rumination. I mean, that's telling that self-critical story, that story about, I'm worthless, I'm unworthy of love, I can't get through the day without a drink, whatever it is being enforced. Those bad patterns are being enforced by the ego. And it may be that having some surcease, some break from that pressure allows people to change. So that's one theory. The other theory that's more recent and has only been demonstrated in animals so far, there's a young researcher named Gül Dölen. She's Turkish, but she lives here, who has done this really interesting work with animals. And her first experiment, which you may have heard of, it got some attention, was to give MDMA to octopuses. Why octopuses? Because they're separate from us by like 40 million years or something like that. And she wanted the most different creature she could find. Octopuses are also incredibly solitary creatures. From the time they mature, they want to be left alone. They go under their rock and that's it. I don't even know how they reproduce, but they don't want to be with other octopuses. She found when she gave them MDMA and then put them in underwater with a choice of two chambers, one where they could socialize with other octopuses and the other where they could go under their rock and be solitary, for a period of weeks after the MDMA, they chose to socialize. Her hypothesis, which she's since demonstrated in several other animals using several different psychedelics, is that, well, this has been well known in psychology since the 30s. We have these critical periods in our development. So there's that critical period from ages like 2 to 4 where you can learn languages like this. You're just like really sticky, and you can even sort. You can learn multiple languages and sort them out. Or in our adolescence, we have this critical period for social learning where we just learn about how the world works and how people are. There's a critical period after stroke for about 6 weeks where with intensive physical therapy, you can make a lot of progress in recovering, and then these critical periods close. And you can no longer learn a language as easily or no longer heal from your stroke. Her hypothesis is that what psychedelics do is reopen the critical period of learning. And that may account for why we're able to relearn different ways of being, living without your addiction, or learning a perspective that takes you out of your depression. So this has to be tried on humans. They actually are going to do a stroke trial. And they're going to focus on physical movement, lots of, learning new physical movements, and see if this works. This is just getting underway at Johns Hopkins. So that's really exciting work. And Gul Dolan is coming to Berkeley. We recruited her for, there's a psychedelic research center at Berkeley that I co-founded, and she's going to come join our team.
Yeah, I'll ask you about that later. Was there a third theory, or did you get that covered?
Yeah, it's kind of related to the default mode theory. There is a theory of how perception works called predictive processing. You may have heard of it. The idea is that when we're perceiving, when you're looking at me or looking at this stage, you're getting a certain amount of information from your senses, but actually your brain is projecting what it imagines is happening. And your senses all they're doing is correcting the errors. And so we have these beliefs that organize our perception. There's a great example that I talk about in the book. There's something called the rotating mask experiment, where you take one of those hollowed out masks, that you see with the theater, the happy and the sad, and it turns on a turntable, and one side of it is convex and the other side of it is concave. As it turns and the concave side comes into view, something weird happens. It pops out and becomes convex. It hasn't changed. Your brain is so firm in its belief that all faces are convex that it refuses to see a concave face. It just imposes its version of reality on reality. Now, there are two cases of people for whom this doesn't happen. One is schizophrenics, and the other is people on a high dose of psychedelics. So what appears to be happening is that psychedelics softens the higher order beliefs that we use to organize our perception. And those higher ones, that's not a high order belief, that's a mid-level belief that faces are convex. Those higher ones are beliefs about our unworthiness, or can be very negative beliefs in some people. And these beliefs are relaxed on psychedelics. We don't know how. And that relaxation, it goes along with the relaxing the ego idea, creates a space in which new patterns can be formed. Again, these are all still speculative theories. They're really promising. We need to do more research. Basic science research is the hardest to fund. It's very easy to fund. I've got a cure for this, or I've got a cure for that. But that's some of the work we're trying to do at Berkeley, and some of this work is going on in other places too.
In your book, I was amazed that this kind of research is not new. Back in the 50s, thousands and thousands of people were getting help alcoholics were getting help with LSD. And even the founder of AA made his breakthrough on LSD. And there were hundreds of clinical papers.
Yeah. This was a big surprise when I started digging into the history. So part of How to Change Your Mind is the history of psychedelics. And I assumed that the psychedelic phenomenon was a product of the 1960s, and that the word psychedelic was such a 60s word. But in fact, it was a 50s phenomenon, and that long before Timothy Leary, there had been this very fertile period of research where LSD in particular, and psilocybin to some extent, was being used in psychiatry. There were 6 international conferences on LSD from 1950 to 1965. There were something like 10,000 papers, 40,000 people had been dosed. It was like a major part of psychiatric research. Alcoholism was one of the big applications, and meta-analysis of those studies, it's important to understand that drug trials pre-1962 were not conducted to the standards that they are today. That the idea of the placebo-controlled double-blind study is a product of the 60s. It doesn't happen in the 50s because of, I forget the name of it, but there was a drug that got approved, thalidomide, got approved, and it turned out to be, it was a tranquilizer given to pregnant women, and it led to birth defects. And so they revamped drug testing. So anyway, in the 50s, it was a little looser, but somebody went through and did a meta-analysis on all the studies of alcoholism and LSD and found they were getting about 50% success getting people off of alcohol, and that's better than anything else out there. The story with Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, was he didn't get sober on LSD. He got sober on another substance that is not used very often, but was given to him at a hospital in New York. It was a psychedelic, and the name of it escapes me. It'll come to me. But after he got sober, he started doing LSD therapy. It was pretty common, especially in LA, in the 50s, and he was so convinced of its value in helping alcoholics that he brought it to the board of this organization he had founded, and they said, "Well, this kind of muddies our message, you know. I mean, they're not into intoxicants of any kind," and they would not include it. But there's a big trial at NYU that's shown it can be quite helpful in treating alcoholism. So he was onto something. Belladonna, that's what he used.
What was that again?
Belladonna, that was the drug on which Bill Wilson got sober. It's a deliriant, it's a deliriant, not technically a psychedelic, but similar effect. The idea is having a mystical experience, surrendering to the higher power, and going through this dark night of the soul that happens when people on the DTs, and the idea was to get all the spiritual value of that experience without the suffering. So there was a logic to it. There's definitely a logic to it.
My favorite part of your book was a trip you took in a tent. I don't know where it is, and I like it so much because of the guide, Fritz. He's just such a good-natured person that you described. And because you shared doubts and fears about whether you should trip or not. Could you share that story, please?
Yeah, I didn't do psychedelics at the appropriate age. I was just too afraid. I had been brought up on all the horror stories, right? I came late to the 60s. I was 13 in 1968. So I watched it all from a distance. And by the time I was old enough to think about taking psychedelics, all the stories you heard were horrifying. People were jumping off of buildings. People would have... the press changed on psychedelics around 1965. It went from being incredibly positive, you wouldn't believe how positive it was, to, the pendulum swung and it was incredibly negative. And so you heard about trips from which people never returned, and it was terrifying. So I didn't go near it. But when it was time to do it, I was in my 50s, late 50s, and I was not going to do it unless I had done my due diligence, because I was really nervous about it. And so I just want to say a word about risk, because I looked at it very closely. I wasn't a risk-taking 20-year-old guy. So I looked pretty carefully, and I was really surprised by what I found. I learned that there is no lethal dose of the classical psychedelics, of LSD, psilocybin, DMT, which is in ayahuasca. That's astonishing. You have drugs in your medicine cabinet that have a lethal dose, and it's not that high. I think Tylenol is like 17 or 18 pills can kill you by destroying your liver. So that was an interesting data point, that you can't overdose. The next was they're not habit forming. Again, the classical psychedelics. If you put LSD in that setup with the rat, and it has two levers, right, to administer things to its bloodstream, it has a choice between the drug and the sugar solution. And with cocaine or heroin, it'll keep pressing for the drug until it's dead. If you put LSD in that setup, it'll press it once and never again. I mean, you can imagine if you're an animal, it's like it can't be a very good experience. So that was interesting. There was no risk of addiction. So what were the risks? The risks were psychological. I mean, there are people who are especially people at risk for schizophrenia because they have a first order relative with it, should not go near psychedelics. Personality disorder, mania also, it can be exacerbated by it. So there are psychological risks. Some people will have really unfortunate experiences that last a long time or result in such bouts of anxiety that they end up in the emergency room. Although even that, some people will say, is not as serious as it looks. There's a great story that Andrew Weil told that I mentioned in the book. When he graduated from medical school, he went out to Haight-Ashbury, and he volunteered in the free clinic in 1968, I think. He graduated from medical school in 67. And there were people coming in. It was, right after the Summer of Love. There was a ton of LSD in San Francisco then. And people would come in, and they were freaking out. And he would come in, and he had his white coat and stethoscope and clipboard, and he'd take a few notes, and they'd talk about, I'm losing my mind. And he had a lot of psychedelic experience, and he realized these were just panic attacks. So what he would say is, he says, will you excuse me, there's someone in real trouble in the next room. And as soon as he said that, they were fine. So the expectancy effects are very powerful. But people do get into psychological trouble. And so it's important to know that. And then lastly, they have accidents, right? I mean, people do stupid things. They do fall. They get in a car. So there are, that's the nature of the risk. I was terrified. I did a series of guided experiences and a couple unguided experiences. And before every one, I was just a wreck and up all night. And should I do this? Should I not do this? In this particular case, I had found this guide who lived in a very remote place in the Mountain West, and he'd been highly recommended, and I'd interviewed him, and I really liked him. He was German. He was a son of a Nazi who had run away from Germany and come to America and become a very skilled therapist. And he likes to start his sessions. So you spend the weekend with him, and he puts you in this yurt. It's this gorgeous setting up in the mountains. And he cooks you dinner, and then he said, I like to start with an MDMA session to get acquainted, because MDMA really creates a very instantaneous bond with a therapist. But I had a heart rhythm issue called atrial fibrillation, and I had been told not to take MDMA because of that, because it can raise your heart rate. So I said, I can't do that one. And so, I mean, this is how much I was concerned. I called my doctor and I said, I'm thinking of taking all these psychedelics. Are there any you think I shouldn't take? And he said, cardiologist, and he said, yeah, stay away from that one. It turns out it was fine, but I didn't take it. So instead, he did something called holotropic breath work. Has anyone heard of that? Yeah, a couple people. Okay, it's a very interesting thing. It's completely legal, no drug involved. It's a way of breathing, a very, very rapid way of breathing, where you exhale a lot more than you inhale, and somebody's beating a drum, and you will enter a psychedelic state. About 80% of people will anyway. It's quite remarkable. It's based on some yogic and Native American practices, and it was devised when LSD was made illegal by Stan Groff, the psychiatrist I mentioned earlier. He was looking for a way to continue to do psychedelic therapy without the drugs, and he came up with this. And now there's apparently a place in Houston where you can learn how to do it. And I did it, and I got into this state where it was quite remarkable. I was lying on my back, and it's very somatic, and I was like moving my legs, and I was riding a horse at a really fast clip. And then after it ended, and I felt like great after it ended, it was like a half hour, I guess, my heart went into this arrhythmia, and it was absolutely terrifying. And because I was in the middle of nowhere with a guy who was breaking the law, was he going to call 911? Could you call 911? There was no phone service. It was a very scary night. It subsided finally, and I was scheduled to do the LSD in the morning. And I haven't told this story. No one's asked me to tell this story. It's not the happiest. And I had to decide overnight. So now, do I want to compound this by having my first LSD trip? So in the end, I went ahead. He gave me a smaller dose, I think, than he would have, because we were both kind of nervous at this point. And it was fine. It was absolutely fine. And not the most profound psychedelic experience I had, but it was really interesting. And it was very much about my family and people in my life. And one of the things that happens to me a lot is I just visit with people in my life, living and dead, and have this intense sense of gratitude for these people. I'm constantly, after these experiences, calling my son and my wife and telling them how grateful I am.
Yeah, that was the interesting part of the trip, also how you integrate the experience. And that's what guides are supposed to help you with. Was there another trip, say, where you had a more profound realignment of your values, say?
So the most profound trip I had was a guided trip on psilocybin on a fairly high dose. It was like 4 or 5 grams. And I was working with this woman on the East Coast who I had also interviewed, and she was just somebody I felt like was very intuitive, and I trusted her. She just seemed like a smart, good person, even though she was kind of new agey in ways that normally get my back up. But I mean, there was a whole altar with wings and crystals, and and she played the worst music. But anyway, so I had this psilocybin trip, and it had lots of different chapters. It went on for quite a long time. I remember at one point she offered me a booster, additional dose, and I was down for that, and I had it, and I got up to use the bathroom, and past the bathroom mirror, which you should never look at during these experiences, and I looked and I saw my grandfather, his skull in this glass. It was just really disturbing. And then I peed and produced this spectacular crop of diamonds that I just could have watched forever. and then went back to see the woman I call Mary in the book. That's not her real name. And she had been transformed. She had been she's blonde, she has hair parted in the middle, she looks very Scandinavian. And she had been transformed into a Native American, an Indian. She had black hair and like leathery skin, dark, and her hands were like ancient. And I knew who she was. There's this legendary character called Maria Sabina, who was a curandera in Mexico, in Oaxaca, who gave the first Westerner psilocybin in the 50s and really introduced the West to psilocybin. And Mary had turned into her. I lie down again, and first we had a little discussion about music, which was really starting to drive me crazy. She was playing the kind of music you would, it would be fine if you were getting a massage in a nice spa, but it was like not, for mental travel, it just was all wrong, for me anyway. And so we agreed on a piece of music, classical music, Bach's unaccompanied cello suites, which are beautiful, very sad, some of them, the ones she put on. And so I went back down, I put on my eye shades, she put on the music, and then the most incredible thing happened. And the pronouns are going to be confusing, but I saw myself burst into a cloud of blue Post-it notes, and that was me, and I was gone. And then they kind of fluttered to the ground, and they pooled in this blue paint, and there it was, and that was me, and I was fine with it, and I was observing the scene from a new perspective that I'd never had. I wasn't me, I was some objective observer. And now with my ego completely dissolved, there's nothing between you, right? There's no subject-object distinction anymore. And I merged with this piece of music completely. I was it. It was me. I could feel like Yo-Yo Ma's bow going over my body, and I was seeing the world from inside that well of space inside the cello. It was just the most beautiful, transcendent experience of music I had ever had. And the fact that I no longer existed except as this piece of music was fine. It was I just had total equanimity about it. That was a powerful experience, and it did have a lasting effect, which was it gave me a new perspective on my ego. I mean, here I watched my ego be destroyed, die, yet I still was alive. And it made me realize that I'm not identical to my ego, which I'd always assumed I was, that's a voice in my head, and there are other ones, and I don't have to listen to it all the time. And so that slight dissociation I think has been really valuable. And sometimes, I just kind of know, okay, I'm having some, I don't know, self-critical thought or this or some competitive thought, and I was, oh, that's him, that's that guy. I don't have to listen.
So there's more inner awareness and a different dynamic.
Yeah,
going on.
It did change the dynamic. Yeah, and not in profound ways, but in subtle ways that have been lasting. So, to me, that's the most memorable experience I had, and the most useful, and the weirdest and most interesting too. Yeah, so that's the one I would put at the top of the list.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Let's say someone wants to try a psychedelic, but they don't have access to a guide like you did. You're careful about not recommending, but in general, can you offer ideas for, say, tripping on your own or with a buddy, or how would you go about it?
I think there are two policemen backstage.
They're on our side.
It's very hard to generalize. Everybody's in a different place with this. I mean, the first thing I would do if I were curious and nervous was look for the drug trials that are going on and see if you might qualify for one of them. The government operates a website called trials.gov, and it has every drug trial going on in the country. And they have to register on this website, and it tells you whether they're accepting volunteers and exactly what kind of volunteers they're looking for. You may, there may not be anything that you qualify for, but there sometimes are ones for people who don't have any mental illness. And there's like a creativity trial that they're talking about doing at Hopkins, and they do these trials with meditators. They're always looking for meditators. So that's one, and then you're doing it legally, and you are, getting the best possible care in a very safe environment. So that would be the first way to go. The other way to go is ketamine therapy. We haven't talked about ketamine, but ketamine is a legal drug. It's an anesthetic. It's called a dissociative anesthetic. And when you get so if you go to an emergency room and they don't have time to figure out, like, do you have this allergy or that vulnerability to a drug, it's the safest one to give people. They give it to kids very often. And in a high dose, it obviously knocks you out. It's an anesthetic. There's a psychedelic dose where you have a psychedelic experience or psychedelic-like experience, shorter than most, but still, I've never done it, but still apparently very valuable. Psychiatrists can, give you a prescription for that, and there are a couple different ways it's administered. So if you want to do it in this as a psychedelic experience, which is the most productive, it's used for depression quite a bit, and it's been effective. Not as effective as psychedelics, but it is effective. You want to do an injection or an intravenous. You don't want to do the nasal spray or the lozenge, which don't seem to work, but are much more expensive, oddly enough, because of the way our pharmaceutical industry works. So that's legal and fairly accessible. There are clinics now in cities all over the country, and I've talked to many people who've had valuable experiences. I'm curious to try it, but I haven't yet. And then the other is to look for an underground guide. Now, how do you do that? Well, I'm a journalist, so I guess I'm better at doing that than some people, but it's really just asking around. By now, many conventional psychotherapists are familiar with this and often have patients who've worked with people, and it's worth asking your shrink if you have one, if they know somebody. There will be a time where they will, and they'll have, or they'll be administering it themselves once it's legal. The other last tip is that there are psychotherapists that call themselves integration therapists. They work specifically with people after they've had psychedelic experience. There's even a listing that is maintained by an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which has done a lot of the drug trials for MDMA to treat trauma. And it's organized by city, and I'm sure there's some integration therapists in Houston. And these people surely know people in the underground, even if they're not. But I strongly suspect many of them are actually underground therapists, but what they can advertise is that they're integration therapists, because it's illegal. And I haven't stressed that nearly enough. It's illegal. Now, it's not a high priority for law enforcement, and there are many places that are decriminalizing psychedelics. This has happened in Oregon. Oh yeah, you can also go to Oregon soon, and they will be offering psilocybin they can't call them treatments, but psilocybin experiences, guided psilocybin experiences. They're getting organized, but they passed a ballot initiative. Colorado will soon offer the same thing. So there'll be certain states. There'll be a lot of psychedelic tourism to Oregon beginning in a year or so. But you can also just wait. I mean, MDMA therapy should be legal within a year or two. The phase 3 trials have been completed. That's the last phase, and they've been very successful, and the data is with the FDA right now. And psilocybin is probably a couple years behind. So things are changing. I mean, this could really be a revolution in mental health care. It's important to realize how few tools we have. Randall was saying in his introduction that there's been more openness to this on the part of mainstream psychotherapy and psychiatry than I ever expected. And when I asked Tom Insel, the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health, why this was, he said, because we're desperate for new tools. The last major innovation was SSRI antidepressants in the early 80s, and they help some people, but there are quite a few people they don't help. And they're not a cure. They address symptoms. We're talking about a potential cure. So it's very exciting, and things could go wrong. We could have another backlash. Stories like the Alaska Airlines pilot who had taken psychedelics before he tried to crash a plane doesn't help, and these stories get legs because they're so scary and compelling. I don't know how to interpret that. It's very rare. I mean, psychedelics don't stay in the bloodstream that long, but maybe it kicked off some sort of psychotic episode, which is it's possible. It's definitely possible, but there's definitely more we have to learn about that. So yeah, but change is coming. And what's amazing too is all this work, all these research trials have been done with, at the beginning anyway, with philanthropic money. Only in the last year has the National Institute of Health made any grants for psychedelic research. The government's just been a little nervous about it, but they've started to. And they're funding a big smoking cessation trial and the OCD trial I mentioned at Yale.
Let's say, I'm just wondering if you had any special advice for people in their 20s, some young people here, and they don't want to wait a year or two. And do you have any special wisdom for curious young people in their 20s?
Well, curious young people in their teens, I would urge to wait a while to try it. I think that an experience that dissolves the ego should wait till you really have a fully formed ego. And you may, but you may not. Boys/men don't have a fully formed anything till well into their 20s. I think that these experiences are very different at different stages in life. And in your 20s, it would just, I didn't do it in my 20s, so I can't really speak to it. I think be aware of the risks. I think if you're more likely to not do it with a guide, which is expensive, by the way, I didn't mention that. So if you're going to do a high dose experience, have someone with you who you trust who is not having a high dose experience, a sitter basically. I think that's really important. Things can go wrong. You may need him to call or her to call 911 or just to calm you down. My son, when he was in high school, so I wasn't writing about this then, so I didn't have to have that conversation with him. But he was hiking with a friend, his best friend Dylan, and they were in the hills above Berkeley. And they took some mushrooms, and I was really pissed that they drove to this place. And Dylan, who was kind of a hypochondriac, was convinced his arm was falling off. He became completely convinced he was going to lose his arm, and Isaac could not calm him down. Isaac's my son. And so they get to the trailhead, and Isaac asks this woman, a total stranger, my friend's having this experience, and can you please drive us to his pediatrician? So they did, and the pediatrician calmed Dylan down, and he was fine. But luckily, my son had his head, on his shoulders, even though he had also taken mushrooms. But he got in a lot of trouble about the car part. So again, people do stupid things. I think I think they're particularly valuable as you get older. And you're thinking about mortality, and I think that there's a quote from Carl Jung in the book that there's a real value to having what he called a numinous experience in the second half of your life to guide you, and I think it's a beautiful idea. But people have different kinds of experiences in their 20s. People have written about experiences that gave them their vocation. That have really set them on a path in life. So I think it can be very valuable. I have a theory that one of the things that drugs can do is, and I should preface this by saying most drug experiences are just as ephemeral as any other kind of experience, right? And people get really bad ideas on drugs also. But every now and then, the encounter of a certain mind with a certain molecule produces a new meme, a new tune, a new scientific idea that drugs are in the context of cultural evolution, are these mutating forces. And in the same way that most mutations are bad, right, and don't help the creature who has a mutation, most psychedelic trips are probably not that useful in terms of changing culture. But every now and then, there is that, it's Jerry Garcia, on LSD, or Carrie Mullis, the scientist, or, there's a whole list of these scientists who've had these experiences. And that changes everything. And that's one of the ways things change. And that's one of the reasons people have been using drugs for all these years, is that on rare occasions, they contribute not just to the individual, but to our culture.
I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. What kind of future would you like to see for, say, psychedelic therapy or legalization? What models, what kind of future, what outcomes would you like to see?
Well, I think there are going to be a couple different futures. Psychedelics are entering or re-entering our culture on a couple different paths. We've been talking about the medical path, right? The therapeutic path. And I think that's the most important. I mean, you've heard this a million times and you know it. We have a mental health crisis. Between the pandemic and social media, we see rates of suicidality going up. We see rates of depression and anxiety, and climate anxiety too is contributing to it. And so we really need some powerful new treatments, and it looks like these may be them. But I think it would be a shame if the medical path is the only one open. There are people who are not struggling with mental health who can benefit enormously and have their lives improved by this. So how are they going to get access to it? Well, there is the underground, and that will continue. I don't think legalization or federal approval will change that. One other path that's opening up is the religious path. There are 3 religions in America that have the constitutional right to use a psychedelic. There are 2 ayahuasca churches, and there is the Native American Church, which has the right to use peyote under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. And there are new churches forming with psychedelic sacraments. Now, some of them are kind of like, I don't know how serious to take them, but a lot of them are quite serious. People exploring psychedelics for spiritual reasons. And I think that there will be a space for this. One of the ironies of this incredibly radical Supreme Court we have, with the really radical jurisprudence around religious freedom that Sam Alito has really pioneered, I think when these new psychedelic churches get to the Supreme Court, he is going to be very hard-pressed to say, no, you're not a serious religion, because he's basically said the government can't say what's legitimate religion, what's not, and the government cannot infringe the practice of religion, and this will be the practice of religion. So it's going to be like an exploding cigar for Sam Alito, and I look forward to that. So that's another path. But then there are people who, what if they want to use them in a creative context? The important point is, I think that these are powerful substances that should not be used casually, and that they need a container. And medicine is one container, and we know how it works, and it creates the proper set and setting, sense of safety. A church is another container that could work, a cultural container. But maybe there's a third one that we haven't created yet, and that's important cultural work to do. But we can learn from the religious container and the medical container. I mean, the religious container tells us that a certain amount of ritual is a really good thing around a drug. Andy Weil has written about this, that people who use all drugs with ritual and a set of rules of the road don't get in trouble the way people who don't. So people who say only drink with other people or only drink with meals, they're much less likely to have an alcoholism problem than people who use alcohol without any ritual around it. So what would be the proper rituals around a completely secular, non-medical use of psychedelics? I think it's a project. I think it's a really important project too.
Well, like the ritual you described, you have an intention, then you have the experience, and then you have integration.
And you could do that outside of a medical context, and you know, the people who invented that format were not doctors. I mean, I write about these amazing amateurs in the 50s who like looked at what the doctors were putting people in a white fluorescent lit hospital room, giving them a big dose of acid, and then leaving. And these other civilians like saw this or were subjected to this and said, you know, there's a much better way to do this. And they would bring in flowers, and they would play music, and they created a living room. And now in the medical context, that's what they do. But it wasn't doctors who figured that out.